My name is Ezekiel Cross. I am 34 years old, and I burned 13 men alive in a basement while their wives slept peacefully upstairs. Before you judge me, before you decide what kind of man I am, I need you to understand something. They didn't buy a carpenter. They didn't buy a healer. They bought their own destruction, wrapped in chains and dressed in silence. The night Cypress Grove turned to ash and cinder, I stood at the edge of that fire, and I felt something I hadn't felt since they tore my children from my arms. I felt like a man again. Not property, not a tool, a man. And every crack of that burning wood was the sound of a debt being settled, one name at a time. If this story already has your heart beating a little faster, you're exactly who I made it for. I'm just an old soul trying to make sure stories like this one don't get buried the way they tried to bury the people in them. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard, please subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, in London, in Georgia, or in Rome, your support is what keeps this going. It puts food on my table and helps me keep telling the truth. Now come with me, because what happened behind that locked door on the second floor of Cypress Grove is something no one was ever supposed to find out. But this story, my story, it didn't begin with fire. It began with a door, a locked door on the second floor of a white plantation house, and a key placed in my palm by the same man who smiled while selling my wife Sarah and my children Benjamin and Ruth like they were livestock at a county fair. Silas Rutledge handed me that key and said, "Keep her quiet." What he didn't know, what none of them ever know about the men they chain, is that silence can be the sharpest weapon of all. If you've ever lost someone and had to keep breathing anyway, then you already understand what I'm about to tell you. And I promise you, this story is far from over. Cypress Grove sat low against the South Carolina earth, like something the land itself was trying to swallow back down. The air there had a weight to it, thick with humidity and the sweetness of magnolia that somehow made everything feel worse, like perfume sprayed over rot. The main house was white, always freshly painted, gleaming under the April sun like a lie told with confidence. Spanish moss hung from every oak like gray funeral veils. At night, the fireflies moved slow and dreamlike through the fields, and if you closed your eyes and forgot everything you knew, you might almost call it beautiful. But the ground there was soaked in something darker than rainwater. You could feel it through the soles of your feet. That soil had swallowed too many tears, too many names, too many people who deserved better than what this place gave them. My days began before the sun and ended long after it surrendered to the dark. I carried wood, I mended fences, I fixed what broke, and in a plantation, something is always breaking. The overseers moved through the grounds like dogs that had learned to walk upright, always watching, always calculating the distance between your back and their authority. I kept my eyes low and my hands busy. That was the arithmetic of survival in a place like Cypress Grove. Make yourself useful enough to keep, invisible enough to be forgotten, and never, under any circumstances, let them see what was moving behind your eyes. Because what was moving behind my eyes would have gotten me killed long before I had the chance to do what needed to be done. The wound I carried wasn't on my skin. The scars on my back had long since healed into thick, quiet ridges. No, what bled every single morning when I opened my eyes was the memory of the last time I saw Ruth's face. She was 6 years old. She had her mother's eyes and my mother's laugh, and she reached for me as they pulled her away, her small fingers grasping at nothing but air. Benjamin didn't cry. He was 9 and already trying to be strong, jaw tight, staring straight ahead like he was rehearsing how to survive what was coming. And Sarah, my Sarah, she didn't look back. I think she knew that if she looked back, neither of us would have survived that moment. Silas Rutledge did that to settle a gambling debt. Not out of cruelty, he'd say, just business. That distinction never made much sense to me. The door at the top of the stairs opened into a room that smelled of camphor, laudanum, and something underneath both. Something metallic and human, like fear that had been living in the walls for years. Catherine Rutledge was sitting by the window when I first saw her, wrapped in a wool blanket despite the April heat, her hands trembling against her knees like 2 injured birds. She was 26 years old, and she looked like a woman being erased one day at a time. The mercury treatments her father called medicine had turned her gums gray and her thoughts to smoke. But her eyes, when they found mine for the first time, her eyes were not the eyes of a broken woman. They were the eyes of someone who had been buried alive and was still, somehow, clawing at the lid. That look changed everything. That look was the moment Cypress Grove stopped being my prison and started being my purpose. My reaction was not what Silas expected. He wanted a keeper, someone to administer the doses, record her episodes, ensure she remained what he needed her to be, a quiet, manageable secret. Instead, I stood in that doorway and made a decision so dangerous it should have stopped my heart cold. I chose to see her, not as a white woman, not as the master's daughter, as a prisoner in an identical cage, just with prettier bars. I pocketed the laudanum. I told her my name, the real one, not the name they'd assigned me at the last auction block. And when she whispered, "They'll kill you if you stop the treatments," I told her something that surprised even me. I said, "They already killed everything worth protecting. What's left of me isn't afraid of dying." The silence that followed was the first honest thing that house had ever witnessed. The consequences were immediate in the way that all invisible things are, felt long before they're seen. Silas began watching me differently, not with suspicion yet, just the particular attention a man pays when something he owns stops behaving predictably. I noticed it in the way he lingered near the base of the stairs, head tilted, listening. I noticed it in the extra portion of food that appeared on my plate one evening, a small, careful kindness designed to remind me of my dependence. Meanwhile, upstairs, Catherine was beginning to surface. The trembling slowed. Her sentences stopped fracturing mid-thought. Color returned to her face in faint degrees, like dawn arriving reluctantly after a very long night. And with that clarity came something neither of us was prepared for: the truth about what was happening in the basement of Cypress Grove. A truth so grotesque it rewrote everything I thought I understood about evil. The first obstacle came in the form of a man named Calhoun, one of Silas's overseers, broad-shouldered and small-eyed, with the particular cruelty of someone who had been given just enough power to ruin lives, but never enough to feel truly important. He began appearing at the top of the stairs at irregular hours, knocking twice before entering without waiting for an answer. He wasn't checking on Catherine, he was checking on me. One afternoon he stood in the doorway watching me change the compress on her wrist, a simple medical gesture, and the look on his face told me he had already constructed a narrative far more dangerous than the truth. In a place like Cypress Grove, the story a white overseer chose to tell about a black man and a white woman didn't require evidence. It only required an audience. I had perhaps 2 weeks before that story became a noose. At night, lying on the thin mat in the tool room where they housed me, I had conversations with myself that I'm not proud of. I thought about running. The calculation was simple and brutal. Every man in chains has done that arithmetic at least once, measuring the distance between here and freedom against the weight of what you'd leave behind. But what would I be running toward? Sarah was gone. Benjamin and Ruth were gone. The north was a direction, not a destination. And somewhere beneath all that cold reasoning was something hotter and less rational, something that had been growing since the moment I first saw Catherine's eyes. It wasn't love, not yet, not exactly. It was recognition, the particular anguish of seeing your own captivity reflected in someone else's face. Running felt like abandoning the only mirror I had left. So I stayed, and I started to plan. Catherine told me about the Brotherhood on a Thursday evening, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed on the door as she spoke. 13 men, judges, bankers, a reverend with a congregation of 400 souls. They called themselves the Harvest Brotherhood, and they met in the basement of Cypress Grove on the first Sunday of every month. She had stumbled upon them as a child, had seen things through the gaps in the floorboards that her father's mercury treatments were specifically designed to make her forget. The rituals were grounded in a theology so depraved it almost defied language. They believed the land's prosperity demanded blood. Not animal blood, human blood. They had been doing it for 40 years, sustained by wealth, protected by the very institutions designed to deliver justice. When Catherine finished speaking, the room felt smaller. The walls felt closer, and somewhere below our feet, the floor seemed to breathe. Then Silas moved against us in a way I hadn't anticipated. He didn't come with accusation or violence. He came with reassignment. A new enslaved man, younger and more frightened than me, was placed at Catherine's door. I was told I was needed in the fields. It was elegant as far as traps go. separating us without drama, without evidence of suspicion, simply rearranging the pieces on his board. But he made one miscalculation. Before Calhoun escorted me from the house that morning, Catherine pressed something into my palm during what appeared to be a routine exchange of linens. It was a folded piece of paper, small and damp with her sweat. On it, in handwriting that still shook slightly at the edges, were 3 words and a date. The book. Sunday. I closed my fist around it and walked into the sun-hammered fields, and for the first time in months, I felt something dangerous stirring in my chest. Hope. The most lethal thing a man in my position could afford to feel. The Sunday before the Brotherhood's meeting, Calhoun found me behind the woodshed and put a knife against my ribs. Not to use it, just to remind me it existed. He told me in a voice almost gentle with certainty that he knew what I was planning, that men like me always thought they were smarter than they were, that Silas had given him permission to handle the situation quietly if it came to that. I stood very still and let him finish. I looked at the ground and made my breathing slow and shallow, the way you learn to do when survival depends on appearing smaller than you are. When he finally stepped back, satisfied that he'd extinguished whatever fire he'd sensed in me, I nodded once and walked away. My hands were steady. My mind was a locked room. But inside that room, behind every door, was the face of my daughter Ruth, reaching for me through empty air. And I understood then, with absolute clarity, that there was nothing left in this world that Calhoun, or Silas, or any man could threaten me with. I had already lost everything worth losing. The basement of Cypress Grove was exactly what fear smells like. Damp stone, burnt tallow, and underneath it all, something copper and permanent that no amount of incense could fully bury. Catherine moved through the dark ahead of me, her hand trailing the wall, her breathing controlled in a way that told me she had been rehearsing this moment for years. The book of records was exactly where she said it would be, behind a false panel in the eastern wall, wrapped in oilskin, heavier than it had any right to be. I opened it by the light of a single candle, and what I found inside rearranged everything I thought I understood about the architecture of power in South Carolina. 40 years of entries, dates, names, amounts paid, rituals described in the detached language of men who had convinced themselves that monstrousness, properly documented, becomes something closer to theology. Judges, a senator, the reverend who had preached at 3 of my friends' funerals. All of them, every single one. But it was the last section of the book that stopped my breath entirely. Near the back, in a different hand, smaller, more careful, were lists. Names of enslaved people, organized by date and by plantation of origin. Beside each name, a single notation, harvested. I turned the pages slowly, my candle guttering in the underground draft, and then I stopped. 3rd page from the end, a name I knew better than my own heartbeat. Benjamin Cross, age 9, acquired Rutledge estate, April 1841. And below it, 2 lines down, in the same careful script. Ruth Cross, age 6. The room didn't spin. I didn't make a sound. I simply sat with that knowledge, the way you sit with a wound too deep for immediate pain. Present, awake, utterly changed. Sarah's name wasn't there, which meant she was still somewhere, which meant this was no longer only about justice. It was about finding what was left of my family before the Brotherhood took that too. Silas was waiting for us at the foot of the basement stairs when we turned to leave. He stood with a lantern held at chest height, casting shadows upward across his face in a way that made him look like something assembled rather than born. He was alone, which told me he had planned this conversation carefully. No witnesses meant no limits. He looked at the book in my hands and he didn't reach for it. Instead, he smiled. The smile of a man who believes every situation has already been resolved in his favor. He told me he'd been watching me since the first week, that he had seen in me something the others lacked: intelligence, restraint, a capacity for useful cruelty. He slid a knife across the stone floor toward my feet and gestured toward Catherine. He said the Brotherhood needed a new kind of member, someone who could move through worlds they couldn't access, someone like me. All I had to do was prove my commitment the same way every other member had. Right there, right then. Using his own daughter, I picked up the knife. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment, because the easy version of this story would have me certain and righteous and unafraid. But the truth is, my hands were shaking and my mind was splitting down the middle between the man I had been forced to become and the man I was before they put chains on me. I thought about Benjamin. I thought about Ruth. I thought about their names written in that book in careful, indifferent handwriting. And then I thought about something my father told me once, when I was young enough to still believe that the world had rules worth following. He said, "Ezekiel, the moment you become what hurt you, they've won twice." I looked at Silas Rutledge, at the absolute confidence in his eyes, the certainty that every man has a price, and he had just found mine. And I understood my decision with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. I turned the knife around in my hand, and I handed it to Catherine. What happened next moved the way real violence always moves. Not like the theater of it you imagine beforehand, but fast and irreversible and strangely quiet. Catherine had not gone to Philadelphia as Silas believed. She had spent 3 weeks moving through the county in borrowed clothing, speaking to people in coded language at church doors and market stalls and creek crossings. The invisible network of the oppressed that has always existed just beneath the surface of the world the powerful think they control. When the Brotherhood descended into that basement for their Sunday ritual, they found the doors bolted from the outside. They found the ventilation shafts sealed with river clay. They found, in place of their carefully arranged altar, a circle of lit lanterns and dry tinder that Catherine and I had spent 2 nights arranging with the patience of people who understand that a plan built on desperation must be built perfectly. Silas looked at me through the smoke beginning to rise and said nothing. For the first time in his life, there were no words available to him. Power, it turns out, is remarkably silent when it finally runs out. 13 men descended into that basement. None came up. The fire took Cypress Grove from the foundation outward, moving through the dry April wood with the unhurried confidence of something long overdue. Catherine and I stood at the tree line and watched the White House, with its fresh paint and its Spanish moss and its 40 years of carefully documented atrocity, collapse inward on itself like a confession finally spoken aloud. She had the oilskin package tucked beneath her arm, the book of records intact, every name preserved for the journey north, where people with the means and the courage to use it were already waiting. I had 4 pages I had torn from the back of the book before she sealed it, the pages with my children's names, and below them the name of the man who had purchased them from Rutledge. A name with an address, a direction. As the last wall of the main house folded into the fire, I felt the ground beneath my feet differently than I ever had before, not like a place that owned me, like a place I was finally leaving on my own terms. They called it an accident, a tragic fire, the newspapers said, a candle left burning, a terrible loss of fine southern property. No mention of 13 men, no investigation worth the name. The world has a remarkable capacity for not seeing what it has decided not to see. Catherine disappeared into the north with secrets encoded in the language of justice, and I walked west into the long amber light of a South Carolina evening, carrying nothing but 4 torn pages and a name. I never found Sarah, but 2 years later, in a settlement outside of Cincinnati, I found a boy of 11 with his mother's eyes and my mother's jaw, who looked at me like he was trying to remember a dream. Benjamin didn't say my name right away. He just stood very still, the way he had the last time I saw him, jaw tight, learning how to survive. And then something in him broke open, the way ground breaks open in spring, and he ran. Some debts can never be fully settled. Some wounds don't close so much as they become part of your architecture, the weight you carry that eventually teaches you how to stand. What Cypress Grove gave me, in the end, was not justice. It was the knowledge that a man stripped of everything except his own conscience still has exactly enough left to choose who he will be. And that choice, that single, irreducible choice, belongs to no master on earth.